Mr. President, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Becky.
We are fortunate to have a lot of news that's been going on today, so it's an opportune time to have you here today. Last night, the United States bombed ISIS from several locations inside Syria. I just wonder if you think that this means that America should prepare for another long battle in this region, and if this can be accomplished, if this goal can be accomplished without putting American soldiers on the ground.
The answer to the first question is I think it will be an extended involvement with air power and with providing intelligence and other institutional support to the people who are fighting ISIS and trying to create a more inclusive set of governments in the Middle East. If you look at Iraq and Syria, they've got a lot of diversity. They need a government, ironically, more like tiny Lebanon, where you have mandated participation by the Sunni, the Shia, the Maronite Christians, the Druze. Inclusive governance is basically the only thing that works in a situation like that. So I think we'll be involved in this for as long as somebody's trying to have total control, particularly if it's ISIS and they're prepared to kill people. They've beheaded 2 Americans. They've beheaded 1 other person now. They murdered a bunch of Syrian soldiers in a humiliating way in the desert. And even though we actually don't support the Syrian government in this conflict in Syria, those soldiers were just people doing their jobs. They deserve to be treated by the rules of war. So, yes, I think it'll be going on a while. On the other hand, no, I don't think it means a projected or prolonged involvement in a land war. One of the things that we learned, ironically, during the surge in Iraq, it worked. It worked because the surge was accompanied by Sunni tribal leaders deciding they wanted to fight for the integrity of their country against al-Qaeda in Iraq. They got angry and they fought. Now, if they can keep a united government and they'll keep fighting, we'll be able to do that. But we don't need to be there on the ground. And I don't think that it means a land war in Iraq. I actually think, in this case, the president of the administration's strategy has a chance to succeed. But I wouldn't expect it day after tomorrow. I think it's going to take a while.
You think that this takes years and years, though?
No. No, and I think there's a difference in eliminating all adversaries and reducing the threat both to Americans and others beyond the borders of Iraq and Syria, but also to the stability of Iraq itself, to the possibility of a reconciled, unifying government in Syria. It's a big difference. No one expects in the world we're living in now that every threat can be eliminated. It's too dispersed. Power's too dispersed. But you can get to the point where the winning side is inclusive, participatory government, and a reasonably secure environment. Do I think that can be achieved in a reasonable amount of time? I do.
Does it require us either arming the rebels in Syria, or would we somehow wind up working with the president there?
Well, that's now above my pay grade. The more I say about that, the more likely I am to cause trouble for the decision makers. I'm not sure I know enough to make an intelligent comment. I'll defer to whatever the Americans say about that.
Let's turn to some of the things that we've been focusing here on in the United States, and that's the economy. And the stock market has been going gangbusters. A lot of people are feeling better because home prices have risen. But at the same time, we've seen the middle class really stagnate. During your presidency, we saw the median income for families go from $37,000 to $49,000. We haven't been able to achieve growth like that in a very long time. What do you think's missing? What's wrong, and how do we fix it?
Median income hasn't gone up for 3 reasons. One is the labor markets aren't tight enough, and we haven't raised the minimum wage as we should. I hope we will. If the Congress doesn't, then all these cities and states are going to. The second reason is we haven't changed the job mix enough. That is, to raise the median income and have more poor people working their way into it, the combination of jobs has to pay, on average, higher wages. So you got to have a source of new employment that pays above the average wage every 5 to 8 years. In the last 2 quarterly job reports, for the first time, I think in 10 years, this has happened. 40% of the jobs were in higher wage categories. So we may be getting there. So I think that is very important. The third thing is that GDP growth doesn't need to growth in median incomes because company after company takes more of its profits and spends it on dividends, stock buybacks, management increases, and less on sharing it with the employees broadly. Although I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 5 years that didn't start to change again. I saw Jack Ma just on one of our panels this morning saying that he thought his investors would make money over the long run if he placed his customers and employees first. This market basket case in Massachusetts and New Hampshire was a big issue because the family that owned it wanted to get rid of the guy that was running it. They thought he gave too much of the wealth of the company to the employees. The customers loved it. So the employees and the customers left. When they got rid of him, they had to bring him back. Nucor Steel was very controversial when it became the third biggest steel mill in America, run by a conservative Republican. It was not a union firm because they paid, with bonuses and wages, 130 to 200% of the average wage that steel workers got in traditional firms. And because they all got educational supplements, they were all in profit-sharing plans, and they had a strict no-layoff policy. And it was controversial at the time, but it worked. They actually made more money, and their communities loved them, and the workers never quit in hard times. So I think that I predict to you that the next big front in this will be corporations moving away from what was a new idea in the 70s, which is the only thing that matters are the stockholders. And the executives should all be paid according to the stock price, back to maybe the employees and the customers should matter more. And then the stocks will be a good investment over any 3 to 5 year period.
But you think that's something that companies do themselves out of the goodness of their own hearts, or you think that's something that the government has to mandate and push?
Well, I think the government can have incentives that would encourage it. You know, they could lengthen the time period for capital gains to trigger, for example. But I think by and large, it will happen, if it does, because of proof that markets work better that way, that companies are more profitable over the long run if they take good care of the communities and the people. One of the companies that always comes here to CGI is Corning in New York, one of my all-time favorites and one that Hillary's worked with a lot. You know, they're popular because they've stayed where they were born. They do a lot of business around the world, but they take care of their communities. They take care of the people that work for them, wherever they are. I think that that's going to become more and more of a gold standard, just like I think all these corporations here who do so much good around the world, taking care of the people at the bottom of the pyramid that they'd like to be able to sell their products to. I think all this is going to happen, that in the 21st century world where power is dispersed, doing good and doing well will become closer aligned. It'll be profitable to do the right thing.
Are corporate inversions unpatriotic? It's been called that in lots of places in Washington.
Well, whether it is or not, companies have, particularly those that are answering to shareholders, have a short-term perspective. A lot of these companies feel duty-bound to pay the lowest taxes they can pay. America has to face the fact that we have not reformed our corporate tax laws when 100% of the people, from Democrats to Republicans, independents, agree we need to. I should make full disclosure here. I signed and supported the bill that raised the corporate taxes in America to the level they are now. Okay, so let me make full disclosure. Now, however, when I did it, let me make further full disclosure. When we were deciding that we had to reduce the deficit to get interest rates down and spark an investment boom in America, and it worked, we decided to have spending cuts and revenue increases about 50-50. And that corporations should pay a little more because their share of the overall tax contribution had dropped dramatically. But I remember the decision we made, and the day we made it, I said, look, we can ask for more, but don't go above the average rate of OECD countries, that is the wealthier countries.
Right.
That average rate was then 35%, and we hit it bullseye. Now, only Japanese companies that for a variety of cultural reasons don't leave pay about what our companies do. We have the highest overall corporate tax rates in the world, and we are now the only OECD country that also taxes overseas earnings on the difference between what the companies pay overseas and what they pay in America when they repatriate the money. So a lot of these executives, even if they want to bring the money home, think, oh, this is crazy. I can borrow the money in America for 2% or something, and interest rates are below inflation. And better that I borrow the money at 2% than repatriate it at 20 or 10 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is. We need to reform the tax system. Meanwhile, I think Treasury Secretary Jack Lew and the people in charge of tax collection have a duty to collect as much revenue as they can from companies, particularly that earn it in America. But nothing that has been done will prevent the Treasury from collecting taxes wherever these companies can set up shop in Palau if they want to. They will still have to pay the American tax rate on the money they earn in America. And we have to come to terms with the fact that everyone else in the world has stopped taxing on the difference between what their companies earn in another country and home. So we normally think of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland as, the very socially liberal, unifying countries that they would always have higher taxes than we do. They do as a percentage of GDP, but they don't tax the overseas earnings of their own companies. Right. So we need tax reform. Meanwhile, the Treasury should do what they can. It's their duty to collect whatever money is owed under American law. If they can find a way to discourage people from moving overseas, they ought to. But the best discouragement is to reform taxes and to give incentives to repatriate now nearly $2 trillion overseas, and to put some of it into an infrastructure bank that will put the rest of America to work. That's another thing that will change the job mix.
Doing something like that, overhauling the corporate tax code, probably would take two sides that would be willing to talk with each other and work with each other in Washington. And I just wonder if you know anyone who might go to Washington in 2016 and start that process.
That may be I have been assaulted by cleverness on all fronts for quite a long while now. That may be the cleverest in I've ever heard. Yeah, I think, first of all, let me posit the first thing you said is clearly right. We can't do this without some bipartisan solution. And, I may be naive, but I always thought we could get a corporate tax fix. Because the Democrats who believe wealthy corporations should actually pay their fair share of America's load understand that it is their money, and you can't make them do something they wouldn't have to do in any other country on earth. It makes it much more expensive to operate here. So a lot of Democrats are in favor of changing the law. And the Republicans, who don't think corporations, they think they're pass-throughs and corporate taxes are double taxes and all that. They understand that in a world where all the gains have gone to people at the very top of the income level, they're not going to get very far pushing the total abolition of corporate taxes. So there ought to be a basis for a resolution here, and I hope there will be. And I hope they'll do it next year. But look, everything we're doing now, including these inversion rules, I have no problem with I understand the Treasury Department is legally obligated to get as much revenue as is owed that they can collect. But we're bailing water out of a leaky boat, and there are only two things that can plug the leaks in that boat. Either we undertake corporate tax reform, or every other country in the world says, we are wrong and we'll go back to doing it the way we used to do it. The latter course seems unlikely. And this is not a morality play. This is practical economics and practical politics. Right. We've got to find a way. And by the way, because we still give more loopholes and deductions than most other countries do, we could actually lower the corporate tax rate quite a lot and eliminate the loopholes and collect at least as much money as we're collecting now. Right. But we do it in a more competitive way so that we could, I'll give you an example. Dow Chemical is a company that has really made a heroic effort to leave jobs in America and to repatriate jobs with growth going up and with energy supplies ample and competitively priced. I think they paid like 33% tax last year, with something like that, with all their deductions. And Exxon, which makes more money overseas but has access to more ample tax considerations, paid something like 17. That's a huge gap. And surely if we reduce the range of the gap, we could figure out, what's our revenue stream now and hold on to it if we just had an alternative corporate minimum tax that nearly every American ought to be able to agree to. And it would be below the global average, the minimum would.
Mr. President, you've been on the global scale for decades. You know what's happening around the world, where the problem spots are, and you understand philanthropy from working with the Clinton Global Initiative. Over the last 9 years, I think CGI has helped and improve the lives of about 440 million people around the globe. If you had $40 billion to play with, what one or two problems would you attack and how?
Well, if I were working around the world, what I would do is to try to empower people. I would try to, first of all, end the deaths of children under 6, which is not very expensive, and get them started in school. You could do that for not very much money. And then establish the competent, honest government in the basics. If you do that, people have worked themselves out of poverty, because all these new markets are attractive to global companies. And because the internet means that the entrepreneurial spirit that is universal throughout the world can be tapped in every country. So if you just got everybody ready and then made sure they had honest government and a framework within which effort could be rewarded, I think that would lead to rapid economic growth and the resolution of these other matters. If I had $40 billion, that's what I do. If I had $40 billion in America, I would try to create universal access to rapid broadband and make sure that we could, in essence, create all these job opportunities flowing out of it. And then I would try to get other people to match it and do what really seems to work in education from Finland to Shanghai, which is I'd pay teachers more, try to get really good teachers, and try to create an environment in which we really believed all our children could learn, and they did. And then we would create an opportunity here that would create more jobs and higher incomes. We're going to have to share the future. It doesn't really matter what you do here. We're going to share inequality, misery, and conflict, or we're going to share prosperity and responsibilities and a sense of community. In that sense, even though it's a little off topic here, I think Scotland did the world a favor with this vote.
Because?
Because the Scots were saying, we could be our own country. We, after all, made unique contributions to science and philosophy In the 1600s, the first British king was James of Scotland. We could well be our own country. We'd punch way above our weight. But maybe we'll stay. Maybe we can have a unique and decisive independence and identity and be part of a larger whole. And our lives will matter more that way. Because in a way, that's the challenge facing everybody. How can you be proud of who you are, raise your children to know who they are, understand their distinct identity and heritage, and be part of a larger whole? Inclusive identities work. Conflict, exclusive identities don't. If by working you mean you get to live instead of die, you get a chance to educate your kids and earn a decent living and share the blessings of common humanity. It's deeply psychological conflict they had to resolve. It was tough. I was very sympathetic with the people who voted for independence and but strongly in favor of those who voted to stay. And that little drama and that is being played out in billions of people's lives every day in another way.
Mr. President, I'd like to end it on that note of hope, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the panel that we were tasked with was to try and get a feel for what consumers think about corporations, the relationships between consumers and corporations. And obviously, that's changed, I think, fairly drastically since the financial crisis. If you go back over not just decades, but over centuries, Americans have had issues dealing with banks, with Wall Street, with the financial sector. You can go all the way back to a former president who called them a den of vipers and thieves. The financial crisis was a very difficult time, and we are still dealing with the after effects. And Tony, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened with the financial crisis, how it changed things, and where you perceive that relationship is right now.
Well, I think the financial crisis created a huge yawning gap between a lot of the country that was suffering, a lot of consumers that were suffering, and a few very visible corporate executives that were still doing very, very well. And I think that created natural resentment. And there's more income skewing than there's ever been. But more than just that, corporations pay, corporate profits are the highest percentage of GDP they've ever been, wages are the lowest. And people feel that viscerally. So even though corporations have in some ways done more to be socially responsible, I think the respect and the trust of corporations, broadly defined, not everyone obviously, but generically, is at a low ebb.
Anthony, would you agree with that? Because it's not just the United States, it's around the globe that this is happening.
I would agree with that. If you go back to the end of the Second World War, what you really saw was a period of increasing prosperity. Every generation felt better off than the generation that came before it. And that has fractured. It's fractured for a lot of reasons. The financial crisis is part of it. Other reasons include slowdown in global GDP growth and, of course, the influence of technology, which is very positive in all of our lives, but does eliminate a lot of low, mid, and no-skill work. So as all of those factors bear down on the economy, you have the citizens of the world feeling more economically vulnerable, more at risk, more concerned about their children's futures. And that, of course, puts a lot of pressure on institutions, particularly on business and finance, where the compact, which was previously business and finance, generated growth and we all benefited, that's been fractured.
Who broke the compact? Who fractured it?
I think it's a combination of a lot of factors that all came together. Clearly, the financial system got some things wrong. Clearly, we had a very prolonged period of loose monetary policy, which fueled a lot of growth. We had a lot of developing factors in the East, which helped the economies grow. But when you take all of those things away, what you end up is in a place where we are in a period of structurally lower GDP growth. That means it's tougher for individuals, it's tougher for governments. And so how do we put that back together? That's really the question.
Secretary Pritzker, you, until very recently, spent your life in the private sector, and so you have that perspective down pat. How did your perspective change, seeing it from the government side of things?
Well, I think that one of the things that the president just talked about is inclusiveness, and what we need is to make sure that the policies that we're promoting and the laws that we're putting in place are encouraging that kind of inclusiveness. It's good for business and it's good for individuals, and we can no longer afford to just do what's good for business and ignore how are the individuals who are, our economy's built 70% on a consumer economy. So we have to work on both, and that's part of, as a government official, something that I have to think about now, which frankly I didn't have to think about as much in my private sector role. But I applaud companies that are stepping up and saying, like the Gap, we're going to raise the minimum wage that we offer all of our employees, and recognize that's good for our business and it's good for all the people working for us. And that's the kind of thing that we need to think about as what's the right policy to have in place so that companies are prospering, but more importantly, that our people are prospering.
Tony brings up a very good point, though. The idea that corporate profits are so high, yet wages are stagnant. President Clinton was just talking about how he thinks companies will kind of themselves come to the conclusion that it's better to pay employees more. Would the three of you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? And Tony, why don't we start with you?
Well, I personally believe the minimum wage is way too low. I'm a lead director of a company called Costco, and they've always paid well above minimum wage. Their starting wages, I think, are over $10 an hour. And they've always felt, and I've seen it work, they get better employees. Those employees are incredibly loyal. They work hard because they know the company's investing in them. They value their job. The turnover's less.
And the company's stock price reflects that as well.
And the company's done spectacularly well. And it's never tried to squeeze the profits out of the employees. And they've gotten a virtuous circle. So yeah, I think it can work, but I think American business has to change their mindset about that.
Penny?
I would agree, and I think you're starting to see that, particularly as it becomes harder and harder to find the skilled employees that you need. Therefore, there's greater demand for people and with talent and skills, and also there's a huge cost to turnover. You both know that. I know that from my own private sector. We can't afford that kind of churning of people. We need to value the people that are working for the private sector and pay them accordingly so that they can be good consumers and buy the products that the two gentlemen on either side of me are selling.
Anthony, it's nice to think of that, but it's also hard to imagine what causes that tipping point.
Well, first thing, we have to acknowledge that this is a big problem that isn't going to be solved by any one part of society alone. Government can't solve it on their own, finance can't, business can't, civil society can't. So everybody's got to work on this problem because it's fundamental to our prosperity and future as societies around the world. I believe that business will increasingly see that it's in their interests, as Madam Secretary said, to have not only employees who are well remunerated and who can contribute economically and can grow and develop in their careers, but also customers who appreciate organisations that do that. For example, in the UK, we pay something called the living wage. It's above the minimum wage because it's deemed to be the level at which somebody can have a reasonable life. And that's our commitment. That's something that we can do as a corporation to make a difference. So I think everybody's got to step up here if we're going to solve this problem. And I think it's in everybody's interests to do that.
Secretary, would you say that you think corporations are given a fair shake in the public perception? Do you think they get too rough of a time? Is it an accurate perception?
Well, I think we're going through a period of where the pendulum has swung very far. And I think that it will revert back to a mean. I think corporations are, as they've gotten healthier and their bottom lines have improved, they continue to invest in the communities where they're doing business. So I think that will improve their image. And so I think that the pendulum will begin to swing backwards. I think let's keep in mind something. 67% of people want to work for a company that they believe is socially responsible. That's something that when you're running a business, you're well aware of. And you're thinking not just about, I want to invest in the community because it's the right thing to do. it's important to do, but also it's necessary to attract the kind of talent that you want to attract for the long haul. So I think that this kind of more virtuous cycle, I believe what the president just said, which is I think we're going to see a moving back to a more positive and more virtuous cycle between business and their employees and the community.
I certainly hope you're right, but a recent survey that we just did, CNBC and Burson Marsteller, shocked me with some of the results. When they queried Americans on this, they found that only 49% of them view big corporations favorably, and about a third of Americans actually look at corporations as a source of fear. That shocked me. Does that come as a surprise to you?
I don't think it's surprising. I think it's deeply concerning, but it's not surprising given everything that we've talked about and everything that the world has been through, particularly in the last 6 years or so. And when people feel personally insecure about their own economic prospects, that is driving a lot of this. And the only solution for that is for everybody to step up and start to work these problems. And the good thing about business is really good at solving problems. That's what businesses do day in and day out.
And I think the fact that we're talking about it, the fact that you're doing studies, the fact that there's greater and greater awareness of this will lead to the kind of problem solving, good outcomes. And that's why I'm generally optimistic that we can right this disparity that we've got.
Tony?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated issue, really, because I don't think there is a brand burnishing that comes from a corporation being a good citizen. But whether that translates into sales to your customers, I think, is a very open question. I think customers want value, want quality at a price. And they're not willing to make much in the way of sacrifice for image, if you will, for that. And I think that varies by how much trust there is embedded in the product. If it's a metal garbage can, they won't care. It's just price. If it's a medicine or a food you put inside you, maybe they care a lot more. So there's some spectrum on that. But I think, as Penny was saying, at least in our company, we have a very active program for community service and giving, all kinds of things. We do it more for our employees than our customers. We do it more for employees than our brand image because they care about it. They want to know they're working for a good place. And they want to feel proud of what they do. And then on the other end, so employees are more on this, what I'll call welcoming, if you will, side of that spectrum. Customers in the middle. And the most objective and maybe the most ones that put the least value on it are investors. And they want return, they want growth. They're much less I think, sensitive to I'm going to buy that stock because they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, show me the money.
And so there's a spectrum of stakeholders, and I think most senior executives do this not just for any of those reasons, because they think it's the right thing to do, and they really believe that, and they feel they're global citizens and they're going to do the right thing.
I do believe, though, that there is a sweet spot where you can actually create real commercial value and solve a problem in the world through the capabilities of corporations. So we just launched a Women in Leadership Index with an exchange-traded note on the New York Stock Exchange. That highlights companies with high levels of gender diversity, promoting diversity, something which is a positive force in society. But it's also our business. That's what we do. That's where we have capability. And it's been very good for our clients because we've got something else to talk to them about. So that's an example of where you can bring all these things together. What Tony was talking about, the sort of more classic CSR things, are great, as he says, for employees. But there are numerous opportunities, I think, for big companies to make money and help solve some of these problems. And that's where you get the real power of this.
That's probably why a lot of people are here at CGI right now, too. We did, in our poll recently, let me show you some of the results that we found, because one of the questions that we asked was, how important is it to you that a corporation clearly defines and communicates its sense of purpose? What we found was that 83% of the people surveyed say that it's either very important or somewhat important, so that the corporation actually defines its sense of purpose. And Tony, I know that you talked a little bit about how you're doing this for your employees, but from what we gathered on this, your customers care too. By the way, we would like to ask you in the audience what you think about that. How important it is to you that companies communicate a sense of purpose. You can either weigh in with this. If you're online with it, I think you can either weigh in as very important, somewhat important, not very important, or not important at all. And we'd love to hear from you too. I think we've got some results that are coming in now. But when you hear these things, is it something that you agree with Anthony that you can make this matter on all fronts?
Well, yes, but I think the problem with these polls are everyone would want a company with not only a sense of purpose, but a good. If you ask people, would it help to have a wonderful, inspiring, uplifting purpose? We'd all say yes. When you go to the grocery store, do you pay 10 cents more for your box of Kleenex for that?
Right.
I don't think so.
I am not convinced either, and I think it probably depends on where you are in the spectrum, how much money you have, how much you can actually vote your conscience, and how much you can't.
I mean, purpose is really important internally, and certainly in similar surveys we've done on this, we find that purpose matters to the younger generation more than it does to older generations. But at the end of the day, purpose has got to translate into organizational performance. Mm-hmm. So if your purpose means that your colleagues are more engaged with their customers and give better service, then that drives the bottom line. It's a sort of second order effect that the customer will experience through the strength of the product, pricing, service, and so on, as opposed to a first order effect. And I think there is a very strong link actually in the most high performing companies between a very strong sense of goal, purpose, values, and organizational performance.
Why do you think it matters to younger generations more?
I think they've grown up in this era of uncertainty. I mean, I have children in their 20s, and I know what they and their friends go through in the job market and so on. So there's this era of uncertainty, and of course, the pervasiveness of information, which causes people to question more the companies that they're doing business with. So it's expressed as important to them. Whether it's enough to make them change a buying decision, I'm not sure. But I am convinced that the second order impact of strong purpose, values, and goals in companies is very important, and that ultimately you will get a commercial return for that.
I guess how much time, money, energy, effort do you spend on some of these? Is it a fraction of the time? Or?
Well, it's been a huge amount of the time that I've put into the 2 years or so that I've been chief executive. But what I'm now doing is building this into the way we run the company, so it doesn't become an additional piece of work. It just becomes how we do business, and that's really the natural evolution of this. It takes time, though, in big organizations.
Tony, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, we have a lot of different kind of programs to try to get at different people, but something like 2/3 of our people volunteer for community service under programs that we organize. When we went public, we set up a big foundation that just sponsors entrepreneurialism all over the United States and increasingly all over the world. It's an ever-present part of everyone's daily lives. And we use it we use it as a bonding thing for employees at the same time that we're providing whatever community service we're providing. So it's a little bit like what Anthony was saying. It serves a dual purpose, or maybe multiple purposes. Our employees feel good, they get to know each other and become friends, and we do something good all at once.
Becky, I would say as I've traveled around the world representing American business, what I have heard from other countries and their leadership is how important it is the way that American business not only respects rule of law and transparency, but also invests in the communities where they do business.
Right.
And so this is something that's being sought after actually quite aggressively by a number of countries around the world.
And you think it opens doors in terms of exports, in terms of building bridges?
Yeah, absolutely I do. And I could, there's a number of companies, you see it all over the world, whether it's Lowe's that is working in Mexico with various schools to try and help schools, or it's GE and the work that they've done to create products that can service the mother and infant health care, and the role that they're playing then in combination of their products also in their philanthropy in those markets. You see it over and over and over again in different companies around the world, and countries are taking notice of it and saying, I want that kind of example in my country to help our companies live up to a different kind of standard.
I do want to point out that according to our audience here, again, asking them the same question, do corporations communicate enough about social responsibility? In the audience, only 18% say yes, 82% say no, that they would like to hear more about that. And I wonder if that changes either of your opinions, Anthony or Tony, about getting that out there. Tony, I know you said that this is really for your employees, but
well, we try to get it out there.
Yeah.
I mean, make no mistake about it. We're proud of it, and let's face it, we think it's beneficial to our brand, and we also want to inspire others. And one of the great things about CGI is it's such an amazing convening thing where you hear stories from other people all over the world, but in my case, other corporate executives and what they're doing. You go back and say, wow, if Anthony can do that, I can do that, or we can learn from that, or we can emulate it. And that becomes self-reinforcing, and it inspires you to reach a little further and get out there. And that's one of the great things that President Clinton and whatnot have done here in 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Penny, I just wonder what you think the role of government is in working with corporations, leading them, teaming up with them. How do you take this and, as you said, export it not only around the globe, but how do you promote that it happens more frequently here in the United States?
Well, I think that it's absolutely imperative that we partner together to make sure that we get the word out about what the role corporations are playing in communities. And as I travel around the world, I make sure to highlight that as much as I can so that we don't have this 82 to 18, but instead there's greater awareness. And I'm trying to make sure also at other governments level, they're aware of what American businesses can bring to the table in their communities. And it's not just outside the U.S. I do the same within the United States in an effort to try and raise greater awareness.
Anthony?
I've noticed as we've been talking, the scores have been getting worse and worse and worse. So obviously not convincing the audience here, but I think perhaps this is a microcosm of the challenge, which is the perception of business today is frankly negative. And we can talk about all the good work we do, but actually you're talking to people who are very skeptical. And the only solution to that is to keep going, keep making an impact, and ultimately that work will gain the credit it deserves. But it's really on us to make that happen.
Anthony, Secretary, Tony, I'd like to thank all three of you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All three of you have companies who have had to deal with environmental concerns, other concerns that have gone around, and you have all taken decisive action. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about what each of you has done. Lisa, first of all, you spent most of your career in the EPA and other government agencies that were watching what happens with the environment, policing things there. Can you tell us what you're doing in your new job at Apple?
Yeah, absolutely. After leaving 26 years of public service, I joined Apple. The title is Vice President, Environmental Initiatives. I report directly to our CEO, Tim Cook. And it's a wonderful position because, as I tell so many people, it's about reach and scale. This is a corporation that when we make one change, when we move all of our data centers to 100% renewable energy, it scales automatically because of the size of the company. So the job is really to be strategic in those ways. Where can we, as a private company, make changes and find opportunities to really make the world better?
Apple's made some big strides over the last decade or so. You mentioned going to the power centers and doing things like that. What are a couple of the biggest strides that Apple's made?
I think the data center story is really the biggest. We're 100% renewable at the 4 data centers that we own and operate. We're 94% renewable at all of our corporate facilities. We're working through our retail stores, where about half of them are renewable now in the U.S. and Tim has said that we're not going to stop until we're 100% everywhere. We have a great history on recycling, on all the programs around electronic recycling that obviously we make great products. They last a long time, but we want them to be properly and responsibly taken care of when they finally reach end of life. And then the company has a great history on toxics, on removal of toxic chemicals from product. Mm-hmm. So the challenge, which is really fun, and I'm sure we'll all agree, is to build on a real history of innovation and of accomplishment, and then to figure out where you can do the next things, because in this time of shrinking governments, the public sector is doing all it can, but the private sector can do things that in many cases can be as impactful.
Mm-hmm. JP, one of the things that you've been focusing with at Hershey is small farmers and where sourcing comes in for cocoa. It's been a huge initiative. You want to talk a little about it?
Sure. One of the things that we recognize is if you look at the total supply chain, sustainability is really important. About 70% of the cocoa comes from West Africa, and specifically Ivory Coast and Ghana. So one of the initiatives we had was, we call it Cocoa Link, and we've put about 50,000 mobile phones in the hands of remote farmers in both those countries. We've partnered both with private sector as well as the government to make that available. And it brings market information, pricing information, and one of the really neat things about using that kind of technology is you have a farmer in a remote area, and if they have a problem, they may not have access to an agronomist to ask them a question. Well, now with these phones, they can take a picture of the bug, or they can take a picture of the tree or a fungus or whatever it might be, and they send it off to the top universities around the world, and 5 minutes later they have a response and an action plan of something they could do. So I think it's a really interesting way that as we look at technology and mobile and so on, that you can really open up many of these remote areas. And I think it's really helped farmers a lot. It helps them be more productive and better yield. And of course, then they get more for their product, and it creates sustainability for us. It's just the right thing to do.
Hugh, did you have any idea what a firestorm genetically modified food would be?
No. It's interesting. I think agriculture, and you see it here this week, agriculture is at the middle of so many conversations today.
Sure.
10 years ago, I used to go to parties and people would say, "What do you do?" And you say, "I'm in agriculture." And they kind of say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, how unfortunate." Today, agriculture and the whole food debate is front and center. We've a place at that table, and this weekend, you look at the debate in climate change. I firmly believe that agriculture has such a strong part to play in mitigating the effects of climate change. And in a busy, crowded world that's going to become more busy and more crowded, we need to figure out how we produce a whole lot more food on a shrinking footprint and consume less. And there's controversy around that, but that I think is one of the biggest challenges facing us. And as a company, it kind of goes to this panel. As a company, we've really doubled down on how we talk about this more, and how we explain where food comes from, and how do we collaborate much more than we've done in the past. So it's I never expected it, but I think it's meaningful work. This is important.
How do you do it? How do you reach out to customers? How do you get that message out?
Yeah, I think 3 years ago I would have said my customer was a farmer.
Yeah.
We sell a seed and the farmer plants it, and I think more and more there's a recognition that we're part of that food chain, and it's a food chain. It's a chain that's very fractionated. So a piece of the how in this, the action, is collaborating much more actively across the entire food chain. It's hard for us to talk to consumers. We're so far back, but we've been doing a lot more work with food companies, and the food companies are getting a lot more engaged in the conversation.
So I'd like to walk you all through a few slides, because we've done our old poll recently. I'm hoping the audience can weigh in on some of these. We did ask whether corporations are becoming more or less socially responsible. And what we can tell you from the poll that we did with Burson Marsteller is that about 63% of adults surveyed said yes, companies are becoming more environmentally responsible, but more than a quarter of them, 28%, still think that companies are becoming less environmentally responsible. I'd love to hear from all of you in the room. Do you think companies are becoming more or less environmentally responsible? And I'd love to hear from you three what you hear back from your customers. Lisa, Apple is known as a young, hip, cool company. We know that that's the demographic that tends to care more about this.
I'm hoping that rubs off on me.
What do you hear back from your customers?
Well, you know, this is about, it's actually an interesting place to be because the company is itself innovative and drives initiatives because of the desire to be on the cutting edge of things. What we find, though, is that there's a great feedback loop there. You know, what people love about the brand is that innovation, you know, taking impossible and turning it into done. You know, this idea that you can make the best products in the world, but they can also be best for the planet. They can be the best products in the world and for the world at the same time. All that's almost expected. And in fact, if anything, you know, it's holding ourselves to the bar as high as possible and not taking not taking the current technology or the current approach for granted, but saying, can we go beyond that? That's what you see every day at Apple.
JP, you have one of probably 10 brands that my kids recognize.
Excellent. Thank you.
I don't know that they care where you get the chocolate, but what do you hear back from the rest of your
Yeah, no, I think consumers really do care. And we ask ourselves a lot about what is the consumer's changing relationship with food. And in our country, a high percentage of our needs are met in terms of diet. So if you look at a developing country all the way to developed, you know, in our country, you say, do you want a white egg, a brown egg, a range-free chicken, you know, all these different things. So we have choice. Some places you don't have choice. So as economies evolve, you have people who evolve to more proteins, and there's good things about that. But as we ask ourselves these questions around this choice, what it really is it's about transparency. And I think that's a really good thing. So people want to know more about, from farm to fork, you know, where does my food come from? What's in my food? And so I think that's a really good thing. And I think it's encouraged companies. It's certainly encouraged our company over time. I mean, you know, we always try to do the right thing, but at the same time, we're in the consumer products business. So we have to meet the needs of people, and we also have to answer their questions. So it's really important. And we've gotten far more involved in the total supply chain, I think, than we ever have before. And we've also found that by doing that, we can make a difference on some of these really important questions that people care about. So I think it's important to all of us, and I think consumers care.
Hugh, it sounds like the same story with you.
Very much so. I think the only difference is I think this begins inside a company. So you can't do different things, you know, across the aisle. So we're a very young company. Half of the organization has been there less than 4 years.
Wow.
So they don't look like me. And I've found that a lot of these initiatives are they're tremendous motivators. It's a piece of our recruiting and our hiring. So sustainability is something that starts inside the company with the organization before it reaches out, and whether that's commitments to saving water, reducing the water that we use. 6 years ago, we started a program with the Gates Foundation sharing water-efficient maize in Africa, so drought-tolerant corn. And that project started inside the company with a bunch of young people. And I'm intrigued by that, what's the linkage between what you do inside a business and how you can extend that to customers and stakeholders?
I should point out that the folks in this room have been fairly on par with what we had seen in our broader survey. About 67% of them say that they think corporations have become more environmentally responsible. Just 13% say less. I wonder what the linkage is. You talk about all of these programs that you've put on. Do you think that it actually changes your consumer's mind? Do you think that they vote with their wallets when it comes down to this? Lisa?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a journey, right? The first is that you have to do it. You have to take the actions, and I think it's pretty fascinating that all of us have started with things we've done, not aspirations that we might have, but here's the proof points. Here are the places where we found where our employees and our customers can engage on this. But then you have to tell them. And I think the communications and engagement aspect is really harder than it sounds, but incredibly important. And we're spending time doing that. And then sort of the last part of that journey is to trust those customers to, if given the right information and given a great product, which I'm sure we all believe is at the heart of it, to make great decisions around it. And I think that's changing, and I think JP mentioned transparency. I want to echo that. I don't usually like that word because you cannot be 100% transparent when you're in a business and competing, but you can be, open and honest and engaging. And as much as possible, our CEO, Tim, likes to say, we keep our product development famously somewhat secret at Apple, but on other things like clean energy, we want people to know what we're doing.
Okay, let me ask you this, though. How do you tell people about it? Because we had another survey that said like 61% of people think you're not communicating these things clearly. How do you tell people about it, not sound like you're bragging, not sound like it's some PR campaign and have it turn back on you? Hugh?
I think it's a great question. I think a piece of this is consistency. So in the business we're in, the timelines are long, the product cycles take a long time. So choosing a handful of goals, being realistic on the milestones, and then being consistent on how you report on those. So I mentioned water earlier. We consume in irrigation, so we grow the seed that we sell the next year. We consume about 100 to 250 billion gallons of water a year. Agriculture in general consumes 70% of the water on the planet. So to the question, how do you communicate this? I think my learning would be choose meaningful goals, set milestones, make them relevant to your stakeholders, but to the business as well, and then focus. Don't keep shifting. So I think that the learning this is it needs to be meaningful, needs to resonate, and then you need to be really consistent on how you do it. And I think, and it's kind of interesting, Monsanto here with branded companies. I think the other learning for me has been the power of collaboration. Companies can't do this on their own, so when you set those goals, enrolling other people and collaborating towards that is, I think, really important as well.
When you say collaborating with other companies, collaborating with other
Well, for us, it's been public-private partnerships.
Okay.
So the Water Efficient Maize Project, Gates has been, the Gates Foundation has been fantastic, but we're working with NGOs in Africa as well. So it's, I think in these long-term things, you really need to partner up, and that drives the need for meaningful milestones, I think.
JP, how do you communicate without looking like it's a big PR campaign?
Well, I think that's a really important element is that, first of all, I think it has to start with just doing the right thing. And I think generationally, the right thing may evolve and change as we learn more. So, we don't go home at night and have evil thoughts. I think it's, it's important to just start from a place that says you want to get things right. And then I think we're in an era of the democratization of information. And so not everybody's going to care about the same things. Mm-hmm. And some people are going to be very passionate about some things, some folks less so. And sometimes that's driven by need. Not everybody, unfortunately, has the ability to have choice. So I think we have to make that information available. One of the things our industry is working on is a project where you can go to a QR code, use your mobile device. It takes you to a landing page. It tells you everything about the product from a nutritional standpoint. And then it allows you, if you have more questions, what's that company's social responsibility message? What are the other things if you want to communicate with a company with a more in-depth question? You can do that, and it's gotten tremendous support with transparency. Hugh and I are both very supportive of that within our industry, and so I think those are ways to start. What I don't always think is a good idea is that you try to market to what are some of these needs versus making sure people are aware of choice. Mm-hmm. And that's really what I mean by the democratization of information.
All right, so let me ask each of you a goal that you have for the next 5 to 10 years. If you can lay that out, explain where you hope to get
Sure.
and how you hope to get there. JP?
Yeah, well, one of the things we committed to is to have 100% certified cocoa by 2020. And I'm really pleased that
what does that mean, 100?
Well, it means that the cocoa that we source from the countries where we source it, they're using good practices, so good agricultural practices. So, do you have kids on those farms? Do they use safe pesticides and fertilizers and so forth through the supply chain? So it's really identifying everything from how it was grown, where it comes from, all the way to the end product itself. So there's a certification process. There was a point in time where the certifiers used to argue with each other, and they would come to us and they said, "We got to go with us because we know so much more about this." And we said, "Wait a minute, that's a mean to an end. It's not the goal to market around that certification." But what certification achieves is really important. And so we're not the only manufacturer. All of our peers really in the industry, the large players have committed to do this in one way or another. And I think most of us are well on our way to exceeding the aspirations that we set for ourselves. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done. But, you know, we would go all the way to the, you know, the farms and the farmers and understand the system. And once we set the requirements and expectations, and none of this happens on a Monday morning. We have to be realistic about that. But once we were clear, capitalism works. And so a lot of people said, well, not only is it not available, it'll cost so much the consumer can't respond. And it just wasn't true. The supply chain was able to do it because it was important. And because it's a competitive environment, the price really equalized itself to a market price. And now we're delivering something that's really important. And it's just about doing the right thing.
Lisa?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think, you know, we're going to get to 100% renewable for all of our facilities, and that's great. I can't say exactly what day that'll happen on, but we're really close. So that's not enough of a stretch. But then comes the supply chain. And for Apple, that means a lot of work on renewable energy and toxics reduction and continued work on recycling around the globe with partners. And, you know, you have to meet people where they are. I think one of the big questions that people often have is, you know, do you take the old regulatory approach of, you know, punish those who don't meet your standards? That's a nice idea. But when you hear what's really happening in the world is, don't you make better good by engaging with people? Sometimes it's as simple as training. Sometimes it's capacity building. Sometimes it's voting with your supply chain dollars. All of those are tools on the table. That's where we'll be.
Okay. You?
We have two. One is in a world that's getting busier, more crowded, hungrier, thirstier, warmer and drier. We set a long-term goal on doubling yields in a couple of our key crops in the next 20 years or so, and reducing by half the stuff that it takes to produce them. And the majority of stuff is water and fertilizer. So how do you sustainably grow yield and consume less? And it's easy to make 20-year commitments. You know, you're never around by the time that you pass the finishing post. The really interesting thing is we've set milestones where we track that on a year-on-year basis, and it's the backbone of a lot of our pipeline development. So that's one, and we're ahead in some, and we're trailing in others. But as a population, we're going to have to figure that out. So I think that's one. And then the other one I touched on is water. So 200 billion gallons of water a year. We've set a near-term goal to reduce that by a quarter. And we're well on the way. I kind of suspect the bar was set a bit low on that one. So better irrigation, more accurate monitoring, much more closely working with our growers. I think there's real leverage in that. But I can't underscore enough. I think a lot of these, we're just on the ground floor with a lot of these things. So much of this, I think, depends on that collaborative approach, working more closely with people in the chain, and being super clear in the near term what those milestones are.
All right. Hugh, Lisa, JP, I'd like to thank all three of you.
Thank you.
And we appreciate all of your time today, too. Thank you.